Welcome to the last lesson in this series, A Sight to Behold and a Song to be Heard, as we kind of investigate the cultural context and liturgical context for Revelations 4 and 5. And so today we're going to be ending the last part of Revelation 5. Revelation 5:11 reads, Then I looked and heard the voice of many angels, numbering thousands upon thousands, and 10,000 times 10,000. They encircled the throne and the living creatures and the elders. Um, Interesting that the um, seer describes talking about looking and hearing the voice of many angels. And so this idea of many angels, but these many angels have one voice, and we're first of all drawn, as it were, to hearing the voice of many angels, but not yet do we know what its content is. Instead, before we get to hear what it is that the many angels are saying kind of in unison, we need a little bit more of a description of both the size of the group as well as the location. So the NIV translates thousands upon thousands. The Greek word myriads, myriadon, myriads of myriads. Some translations may have. And this word myriad really describes something of an innumerable number. In other words, they can't be numbered. So once you describe it as thousands upon thousands, well, I guess thousands gives it this sense of well, we don't know how many thousands, but it could be not being able to give a precise number of it. The idea is to try and create something of a very large crowd. Now, historically throughout the ages, um, there have been some very large crowds, sometimes at certain pilgrimages in Asia, for instance. There can be millions of people who gather together in order to participate in some kind of pilgrimage event, some kind of reverence activities. And so here the author is trying to depict, as it were, this scene in which so many angels are present that you cannot even number them. They are beyond the comprehension of what a person could sit and count. So it's trying to give this idea of the type of majesty that is being created by this scene. And not only is it innumerable, but also in its position. So all of this is taking place as they're encircled around the throne. In other words, they're encircled around God. And these living creatures that have been mentioned, the four living creatures, and then the 24 elders, which may be symbolic of the humanity collectively. In a loud voice, they were saying. So now we get to what it is that was heard. Worthy is the Lamb who is slain to receive power and wealth and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and praise. The Lamb's slaughterness stands at the forefront here. It's not just worthy is the Lamb, but it is worthy is the Lamb who was slain. To always remember. Now, the slain Lamb has already been introduced earlier. But even in its praise, the lamb's slaughterness stands there. And this slaughterness stands in a kind of ironic tension with the lamb's worthiness. So to proclaim worthy is the lamb is to indicate this being has status. And yet being slaughtered indicates that the lamb has been a victim. Now there's a tension here because in the Roman world, if you were slaughtered, then you didn't receive honor. You don't receive worthy. In other words, you were defeated. In other words, you want to celebrate, give worthy admiration, recognition to the conqueror, not to the one who has been conquered, or at least seems to be conquered. And so here, the praise that is taking place keeps together, as it were, at the core theology, Christian theology, that something about Jesus's crucifixion, his death, is the means by which he becomes honored in the heavenly realms. And the list of things that the Lamb is worthy of to receive. He's going to receive, as it were, God's 7 qualities. These qualities of power, wealth, wisdom, strength, honor, glory, and praise. These words are used throughout Scripture to talk about God, or sometimes they're used to talk about kings, earthly kings, that they receive these things. So, in other words, it sounds as if that what's happening here is the Lamb is receiving his adoration, as it were, as the one who rightly should reign, as as the representation of God's kingship over all of creation. So this draws the Lamb then closely into the identity of God. There's still this distinction that is kept between the Lamb and the throne, yet the Lamb is now receiving all these qualities that historically and throughout Scripture are ways of ascribing honor and majesty to God. Then I heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth and on the sea and all that is in them saying, to him who sits on the throne and to the Lamb be praise and honor and glory and power forever and ever. Jesus then, John hears the entire universe's destiny, as it were. And this is where all of creation is going, both the things that are created in the heavenly realms and those that are created on earth or under the earth. Every creature, as it were, is destined towards this. And that is the worship of God and the worship of Christ and their co-regency. That is, that it's not just that God is sovereign, but he operates his sovereignty over the world through his Son, through Christ. So Christ shares, as it were, in the divine sovereignty over creation. And this is what makes Christian worship distinctively Christian. Lots of different religions will have a worship of a divine being. Even kind of more closely to Christianity when you think about Judaism or Islam, we have the worship of Yahweh, or we have the worship of Allah, we have the worship of God. But what's distinctive about the Christian worship is the recognition that God is exercising his sovereignty through the medium of Christ. And so as Christ exercises his lordship over all of creation, it is the lordship of God, the lordship that belongs to God, that is being mediated throughout all of creation. Interestingly, here in this praise, or what's being said here by every creature in heaven, is that the word wealth and the word wisdom, which were mentioned just in the previous verse 12, they're not listed here. And instead of the word power, now the NIV has and glory and power, but actually the word power here is a different word than what's used in verse 12. In verse 12, it was dynamis. This is one form, one way of thinking about exercising of authority or power. But here it is strength, kratos. And so it's interesting that the word has changed. I'm not quite sure how significant the distinction needs to be kept. And maybe that's why it's been glossed by the NIV with just the same English word. But what is happening here is a depiction of the heavenly throne room in ways that is reminiscent of kind of an imperial court. So the book of Revelation was written, during the time of Roman imperialism. And probably by the time that the book of Revelation was written. So I'm thinking it's sometime in the 80s, maybe in the 90s. Um, you already have established throughout the Roman world a kind of recognition of the divinity of the um, imperial authority. Now, that doesn't mean that every Roman emperor was thought of as a god or seen as a god. Some emperors like Caligula was certainly not seen that way, especially after he was assassinated, and Nero would probably be the same. But there is kind of a um, belief, or there was a practice of recognizing that whoever was ruling as emperor was ruling at the behest of the gods, and that the gods were somehow or another bestowing their blessings upon the authority of the Roman emperor. And so, in the court scenes of emperors, the idea is to kind of stress, as it were, the status of the emperor. Now, in the Roman world, the status is a huge a thing. Everyone in the Roman world operates in relationship to how much status they acquire or can acquire. And so a a person of means wants to try and gain more status. And there are different ways in which that is done. It certainly can be done by the acclamation of wealth, property, the number of slaves that you have, or what power you exercise over others. That is a way of establishing your status. And so when people are coming in to see the emperor, it is important as well that the scene that is set up is to emphasize how much status the emperor has. So a person who comes in, as it were, to the throne room, what you are supposed to see is all that is indicating what the emperor has under his control. So what we have here is in the heavenly realm. We are seeing one who sits on a throne, and they too have, all that the Roman emperors would have, and more so. So not only is all of creation, or all of the humanity, all of the world, under God and the Lamb's authority, but also everything within the heavenly realms is under their authority. And so the author uh, paints a view, a picture, as it were, of the heavenly throne room, recognizing the status of God and the status of the Lamb to receive the ultimate praise and the ultimate worship of every living creature. The four living creatures said, "Amen," and the elders fell down and worshiped. Heaven recognizes who is really in charge. So the living creatures, the elders, they know what's really going on. They know who ultimately is in charge, and that is the one who has been slaughtered. The one who seemingly looks like he has been defeated is actually the one who is being entrusted by God to exercise his sovereignty over creation. And he's the one that deserves every being's loyalty and worship. So the four living creatures and the elders, representing, as it were, all of creation, recognizes that they ought to show their loyalty to the Lamb, and that they are to worship the Lamb. The idea of worshiping the Lamb is, again, this movement that helps to make Christianity quite distinctive. So, for a lot of Jews, you're only supposed to worship Yahweh. Now, that although you're only supposed to worship Yahweh, that doesn't mean, or doesn't, you know, um, indicate that you can't reverence other things. So a Jew can show reverence to an emperor, or can show reverence to a person of high status. Um, they can do things that recognizes human individuals, um, power or their worth, and so too with other celestial beings. So there can be beings that can be um, respected or shown awe. But there is an activity that is the sole, as it were, property of God. That is worship, and that worship, recognizing God as the one who stands above all others. That belongs to God Himself and should not be given to anything else. And so, but now with Christians, worship can also be directed towards the Lamb. And so the Lamb shares in divine worship. Now, that's probably where, you know, uh, Judaism and Muslims will disagree with um, the Christian idea of worship, as well as most other people, that something about Christ and about His identity and about what has happened to Him and what has now been given to Him means that He is deserving of the worship that has been reserved for God. And so this worship of the Lamb, now joined as it were with the worship of God, brings the Lamb and God into this shared identity and shared activity, and what really stands, as it were, or makes Christian worship distinctive. Christian worship, then, as well, is the countercultural activity that reminds believers not to serve competing narratives about who rules the world. So, to start off this vision that we have in the book of Revelation with worship, to draw, as it were, the readers in the first century to this heavenly scene, is to remind the believers who have already been addressed in Revelation chapter 2 and 3, as there are these letters to these churches and kind of the warning to these churches about making sure that they don't capitulate, as it were, to practices that ends up serving or recognizing the honor of the emperor at the expense of recognizing or honoring God as the one who is ultimately in charge. So, Christian worship, the worship of the Lamb, is this continuingly resistance that believers participate in to tell not only themselves, but also to tell other people, non-believers, that they are not going to serve a narrative or buy into a narrative that claims that somebody else is in charge of what's going on in the world rather than Christ. So that's the distinctive power of Christian worship. Worship can be an encouraging thing when we come together. It can lift our spirits up. It can create intimacy between fellow believers. But at the core and heart of Christian worship is this acclamation to ourselves and to the rest of the world about who is running things, who ultimately has our destiny in His hands. So, as we think about now this wonderful vision of heavenly worship of both God on His throne and of Christ, the slaughtered, the slain Lamb, I'm reminded as well of some of the things that we do in our Christian worship, or in a lot of Christian worships, and the songs that we sing, and some of the things that we do in worship that kind of is reminiscent of what's taking place here in the book of Revelation. One of the songs that we sing, of course, is "Worthy is the Lamb." Um, the words are, worthy is the lamb that was slain, worthy is the lamb that was slain, worthy is the lamb that was slain. This repetition of focusing in on the slaughteredness of Christ, and that even though he may appear to be defeated, even though he is one who seems to be the victim of the powers that were against him, nevertheless, he receives honor. And so it picks up the language that we have here about to receive power and riches and wisdom and strength, honor, glory, and blessing. So we sing this song, and this is a song that is oftentimes sung in repetition. We sing it through several times, re-emphasizing once again this majestic vision of who it is who not only is receiving all the authority and the power, receiving all of the accolades, as it were, but that he is also the one who has been slain, not just for our benefit, but also for the redemption of all creation. We also sing another song that reminds his ruling, that is majesty. And when we sing this song, Majesty, once again, we're picking up these ideas of the authority that is being held. Majesty, worship his majesty. Unto Jesus be all glory, power, and praise. Majesty, kingdom, authority, flow from the throne unto his own, his anthem raise. So again, we're singing these songs to kind of lift up this idea of ruling, because as we as Christians oftentimes experience, we oftentimes feel ourselves subjected to the power of others. There are other things that are outside of our control. There are other things that force us to experience things that we may not want to experience. And we sometimes can come under the illusion, the myth, that it were, that these are the things that are ultimately in charge. But singing songs like Majesty and Worthy is the Lamb are reminding us that no matter what it is that we experience, whether trials or persecutions, whether it is that we experience hardships, whether or not we experience injustice in the world, nevertheless, there's somebody who is ultimately in charge. And there are forces that are at work right now, but these forces eventually must give account to someone greater than themselves. So, in all of this, believers are invited, as it were, while they're fighting against imperial powers of their own day and each in their own culture. Revelation 4 and 5 invites believers to kind of sing the song of the heavenly choir. With one voice, the angels are singing. With one recognition, the living creatures and all the elders are seeing this creation of what's going to happen in the future. We're getting ready to enter into Revelation 6. You start beginning to see all the judgments that's coming on. But before you engage in all the judgments and all the woes and all the heartaches and all the disasters that befall humanity, ultimately what's going to happen is all of creation will one day worship the one who is exercising his power over all things. And to see that vision of what John is allowing us to see, as he's opening up heaven, he's allowing us to see something we can't see now. It is truly a sight to behold. And he allows us to hear a song that's being sung. It is a song that we desperately need to hear in the times in which we live.